She kicked me out for losing my job, then saw me on TV and regretted everything. I woke up at 5:47 a.m. Same as always. Coffee, boots, silence. I had no idea that in 3 hours, my entire life would disappear under the word restructuring. You know that feeling when you're walking through your own house and everything feels just right? That morning in Asheville, North Carolina, I did my usual rounds. Kitchen first, checked the cabinet door I'd fixed last weekend. Still solid. Living room. Ran my fingers along the mantel I'd carved from a single piece of oak. Perfect grain, no splits. Every nail in that house was driven by these hands. Every board measured twice. Cut once. This wasn't just a house. This was proof I existed. Sarah always said I was obsessed with that place, but she never understood. When you build something from nothing, when you turn raw lumber into a home where your kids take their first steps, where Christmas mornings happen, where life actually lives, that's not obsession. That's legacy. I'd built that house the same way I approached everything else. Methodically, carefully, with respect for the materials and the process. Same way I'd worked at Global Woodworks for 15 years, turning trees into furniture that would outlast the people who bought it. Walking to my truck that morning, I felt that familiar surge of pride looking at the factory in the distance. Smoke rising from the stacks meant production was running smooth. Meant another day of good, honest work. Meant I was part of something bigger than just a paycheck. My grandfather, Jonathan Brooks, used to say the best measure of a man wasn't his bank account, but how many things he'd built that were still standing after he was gone. By that measure, I was doing pretty well for a guy who started with nothing but callous hands and a stubborn streak. The drive to work took exactly 12 minutes. Same route every day past Henderson's Dairy Farm, past the Old Methodist Church, past Miller's Auto Shop where they still fix things instead of just replacing them. Small town America at its finest. The kind of place where a handshake still meant something and your word was your bond. I parked in the same spot I claimed 5 years ago, right next to the loading dock, where I could watch the lumber trucks come and go. There's something about the smell of fresh-cut pine and the sound of machinery working in harmony that just felt right, like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. But walking into that break room, I knew something was off. Dead silence. 20 guys who normally spent their mornings complaining about their wives, their trucks, or the Carolina Panthers sat there like they'd seen a ghost. Big Jim Morrison, who'd been with the company since the Carter administration, looked up at me with eyes that had lost their fight. "Meeting in 10 minutes, he said. His voice sounded like gravel in a cement mixer. All hands. I'd heard those words before. Every blue-collar worker in America has heard those words. They're never followed by good news. The conference room was packed tighter than a Black Friday sale. Guys were shoulder to shoulder, some leaning against walls, others just standing there trying to look invisible. The air was thick with the kind of tension that comes right before someone's world gets turned upside down. Then in walked the suit. Not just any suit. This was one of those $1,000 numbers that screamed, "I've never worked a day with my hands in my life." Briefcase that probably cost more than most of us made in a month. Hair so perfect, it looked like it was photoshopped in real life. His name was Richard something or other. Didn't matter. He was just another corporate messenger, delivering someone else's bad news. "Gentlemen," he started, and I clenched my jaw so tight it could have cracked concrete. Nobody calls a room full of working men gentlemen, unless they're about to screw them over. Due to market fluctuations and the need to optimize our operational efficiency, Global Woodworks Incorporated has been acquired by Consolidated Manufacturing Solutions. Optimize. Efficiency. Solutions. I could smell the corporate bullshit from across the room. The new ownership has decided to implement a workforce reduction strategy focused on operational streamlining. More fancy words. Then came the real punch. Employees over 40 with more than 10 years of service will be affected by this restructuring. My blood went cold. 40 plus with 10 years. That was me. That was Big Jim. That was most of the guys who actually knew how to run this place. They weren't just laying people off. They were getting rid of anyone who remembered when this company actually gave a damn about its workers. The following individuals need to report to Human Resources immediately after this meeting. The suit started reading names from a list. Each name hit like a hammer blow. Morrison, James. Thompson, Carl. Rodriguez, Miguel. Brooks, Martin. My name echoed in that room like a death sentence. 15 years of perfect attendance, 0 safety violations, and consistently exceeding production targets. And I was on the list. I watched the faces around me. Relief mixed with guilt on the younger guys, stone-cold terror on those of us called out. We were the old guard, the expensive employees with accumulated sick days and vacation time, the ones who expected raises and respected the union. In corporate math, experience equals liability. Knowledge equals overhead. Loyalty equals expendable. The suit kept talking about comprehensive transition packages and career development resources, but I wasn't listening anymore. I was doing the math in my head. Mortgage payments, car payments, Emily's senior year expenses, Caleb's college tuition. The numbers didn't add up. They never do when your income drops to 0 overnight. Walking to HR felt like a death march. The hallway I'd walked thousands of times suddenly felt foreign. Fluorescent lights buzzing overhead like vultures. Each step echoing off industrial tile that had seen better decades. Margaret in HR, sweet lady who processed my paperwork for 15 years, couldn't even look me in the eye. She slid a manila folder across her desk like it contained nuclear waste. Martin, I'm so sorry. This isn't my decision. Inside that folder was my entire professional life, reduced to legal documents. Severance calculation, 2 weeks for every year of service. COBRA insurance options that would cost more than my mortgage. A phone number for career transition services that would probably put me on hold for 45 minutes before telling me to update my LinkedIn profile. 30 weeks of severance pay. Sounded generous until you realize it was corporate America's way of saying, here's enough money to keep you quiet while you figure out that nobody else is hiring 45-year-old cabinet makers either. I signed where they told me to sign. Initial where they told me to initial. Handed over my security badge and company keys like I was surrendering my identity. Margaret handed me a cardboard box. The universal symbol of professional failure in America. You have until 5 o'clock to clear out your workspace. 5 o'clock. 15 years of building career. And they were giving me 6 hours to erase all evidence I'd ever been there. Cleaning out my workstation felt like attending my own funeral. Tools I'd used for 15 years suddenly looked foreign. The workbench where I'd crafted thousands of pieces of furniture was just wood and metal now. The smell of sawdust that had been as familiar as my own cologne now seemed to mock me. I packed slowly, methodically. Thermos Sarah had given me for my birthday. Picture the kids from when they were small enough to think I was a hero. Work gloves that had molded to my hands over the years. A lifetime of small things that suddenly felt enormous. The drive home was the longest 12 minutes of my life. Same route, same landmarks, but everything looked different now. Henderson's dairy farm, probably struggling just like everyone else. The Methodist church, probably seeing record attendance from all the folks praying for miracles. Miller's auto shop, probably about to lose half his customers. I was 45 years old with a high school diploma and a skill set that was apparently obsolete. In corporate America, that makes you about as valuable as a horse and buggy in rush hour traffic. That first evening, I told Sarah and the kids what happened. Sarah went quiet for a long moment, then nodded like she'd been expecting this. The kids looked worried, but not panicked. We were Americans. We'd figure it out. That's what we do. It's temporary, I said, more to convince myself than them. I'll find something better. Sarah gave me a half-hearted nod without looking up. Of course you will, she said, already halfway out of the conversation. For about a week, I believed her. But finding work at 45 isn't like finding work at 25. Every application disappears into some digital black hole. Every interview ends with "we'll be in touch," and silence that stretches forever. The younger guys get hired. The guys willing to work for half what I used to make get hired. I don't get hired. By week 2, the worry line started showing on Sarah's face. By week 3, she was making comments about my approach to job hunting. By week 4, The comments turned into suggestions. By week 5, suggestions turned into criticisms. Maybe you're being too picky, Martin. Maybe you should consider other industries. Maybe 45 isn't too old to learn something new. Maybe. Each maybe felt like a tiny knife cut. The worst part wasn't the rejection letters or the empty bank account. It was watching my family's respect for me evaporate one disappointing day at a time. I went from being the provider to being the problem, from being the guy who fixed everything to being the thing that needed fixing. Sarah started making dinner decisions without asking me, started handling the bills without consulting me, started answering the phone when potential employers called, explaining that I was out looking for work, even when I was sitting right there. The kids began avoiding eye contact when their friends came over. Caleb stopped mentioning college plans. Emily stopped asking for money for senior activities. Our house, once filled with easy conversation and laughter, became a museum of careful silence. By the 6th week, she wasn't even pretending to hide her frustration anymore. Martin, you've been unemployed for over a month. Maybe it's time to face reality. We were sitting at the kitchen table I'd built with my own hands, going over bills we couldn't pay. Caleb was upstairs, probably wondering if college was still happening. Emily was in her room, probably wondering if her senior year activities were getting canceled. What reality is that, Sarah? That you're unemployed, that this isn't working, that we need a new plan. The way she said unemployed, like it was my name now instead of my temporary situation, cut deeper than any corporate layoff notice. I'm trying, Sarah. Every damn day I'm trying. Trying isn't paying the bills. Trying isn't getting Caleb's tuition together. Trying isn't. Enough? I said, louder than I meant to. I get it. But I didn't get it. Not really. Because I was about to learn that 6 weeks of unemployment was just the warm-up act. Week 7 brought the first real fight. Sarah wanted me to take a job at the big box hardware store. Part-time, minimum wage, no benefits. The kind of job where they put an orange apron on you and pretend you're helping people while you're really just directing them to the self-checkout kiosks. It's honest work, she said. It's not enough to live on. It's better than nothing. Nothing. That's what she thought I was bringing to the table. Nothing. Week 8, she started calling me unemployed in front of kids. Ask your unemployed father if he can drive you to practice. Maybe when your unemployed father finds work, we can think about that. Each time, Caleb and Emily would look at me with this mixture of embarrassment and pity that made me want to disappear into floorboards I'd install myself. They'd grown tired of defending me to their friends, tired of making excuses for why Dad couldn't afford this or that anymore. By week 9, I was taking a hardware store job just to stop the constant criticism. 8 hours a day in an orange apron, explaining to customers why the screws they wanted were in aisle 12 when any competent carpenter could tell them exactly what they needed in 30 seconds. The pay was a joke. The schedule was inconsistent. The management treated me like I was lucky to be there instead of recognizing that I knew more about building materials than their entire corporate training program. But it stopped Sarah's daily commentary about my unemployment situation. Week 10 brought a new problem. Sarah's flower business, the one that had been getting off the ground for 3 years, had another catastrophic failure. This time it was some kind of fungus that wiped out her entire spring inventory. Instead of admitting that maybe running a greenhouse required more than enthusiasm and Pinterest inspiration, she blamed everything else. The weather, the suppliers, the customers who didn't appreciate quality. If you hadn't lost your real job, she said, I could have invested in better equipment. Real job. My 15 years of skilled craftsmanship was a real job. My current employment was apparently fake. Sarah, you've lost money 3 years running. Maybe the problem isn't the equipment. Wrong thing to say. Dead wrong. At least I'm trying to build something instead of just wallowing in self-pity. Self-pity. 6 weeks of job hunting followed by swallowing my pride to take minimum wage work was self-pity. Week 11, Sarah started staying late at the greenhouse, working on new business strategies that seemed to require a lot of phone calls and even more wine. When I'd ask about dinner, she'd wave me off. I'm building our future, Martin. Someone has to. Our future, built on dead flowers and delusions of entrepreneurial success. The kids started eating dinner with me in silence, like they were watching their parents slowly come apart in real time, which I guess they were. Emily would glance between us with those big, worried eyes, while Caleb just kept his head down, probably calculating how much longer he had to endure this before escaping to college. Week 12 brought the final blow. I came home from my shift at the hardware store to find Caleb, and Emily sitting at the kitchen table with faces like they'd seen a car accident. "Dad," Emily said quietly, "Mom wants to talk to you." Sarah was in the living room, sitting in the chair I'd reupholstered last Christmas. On the coffee table I'd made from her claim barn were divorce papers, spread out like a hand of cards in a poker game I didn't know I was playing. "Martin, I can't do this anymore." She was perfectly composed. Hair done, makeup fresh, like she prepared for this conversation the way other people prepare for job interviews. "Can't do what, Sarah?" "This. Us. The uncertainty. The stress. I need stability, and you can't provide that anymore. Like I'd been failing her for years instead of working my ass off to give her everything she wanted while she played farmer with plants that wouldn't grow." "What are these papers, Sarah?" "Divorce papers," she said simply, like she was discussing the weather. "I filed last week. I was just waiting for the right moment to tell you. You're divorcing me? Now, I lost my job 3 months ago, and you're kicking me when I'm down." The right moment. While I was working minimum wage to keep food on the table, while the kids were stressing about their futures, while our entire world was already falling apart. That was the right moment for her to twist a knife. "The house is in my name, Martin. Has been since we refinanced 5 years ago. Remember? You said it would be better for tax purposes." I remembered. I trusted her completely. Signed whatever papers she put in front of me, because that's what married people do. They trust each other. They build things together. Apparently, she'd been building an exit strategy while I was building our future. "You're taking the house?" "The house I built with my own hands." "It's not personal, Martin. It's just practical. I need somewhere stable for Emily while she finishes high school. Caleb needs to know he has a home to come back to during college breaks. You understand? Personal." She was taking 15 years of my sweat and blood and calling it not personal. I looked around that living room one more time. The mantel I'd carved, the built-in shelves where we displayed family photos, the hardwood floors I'd installed board by board. Each loving detail was a piece of my soul hammered into wood and drywall, and she was keeping it all because it was practical. "Where am I supposed to go, Sarah?" "You'll figure something out. You always do." But the way she said it, it didn't sound like confidence in my abilities. It sounded like dismissal, like I was somebody else's problem now. Standing up from that couch, the one I'd reupholstered with my own hands, I felt something break inside me that had nothing to do with unemployment or divorce papers. It was a sound of trust shattering, of 22 years of marriage crumbling like termite-eaten wood. That night, I packed everything that mattered into one cardboard box. Didn't take long. Amazing how a man's whole life can fit into something that used to hold copy paper. Photos of the kids from when they were small. My grandfather's pocket watch. A coffee mug Emily had made me in second grade art class. The deed to 10 acres of overgrown land outside town that everyone called the Brooks Dump, the only thing I'd inherited from my grandfather besides debt and stubbornness. Granddad had bought that land back in the 60s, planning to build something special there someday. Never got around to it. Just let it sit, collecting junk and disappointment for 40 years. Always said it would be worth something eventually. Turned out he was right, just not in the way he expected. Loading that box into my rusty pickup truck, I felt like I was carrying my own coffin. 15 years at the factory, 22 years of marriage, 45 years of trying to do everything right. All of it reduced to one cardboard box that rode shotgun while I drove away from the only life I'd ever known. As my grandfather used to say, when life gives you lemons, find some tequila and salt. Or at least figure out where you're going to find the tequila and salt. I drove through Asheville one last time, past a factory that had already forgotten my name, past a house that was no longer mine, toward 10 acres of scrubland that nobody wanted and everybody avoided. I was heading nowhere, to a place that was supposed to be my last resort, not knowing that somewhere in that forgotten wasteland, buried under years of neglect and disappointment, waited something that would change everything. The Brooks Dump. That's what everyone in town called it, and standing there with my cardboard box and wounded pride, I could see why. 10 acres of forgotten dreams stretched out in front of me like a graveyard for good intentions. Rusted car parts. Collapsed sheds that looked like they'd given up fighting gravity sometime during the Reagan administration. Weeds taller than me swaying in the breeze like they owned the place. This was my inheritance. This was what 40 years of my grandfather's, someday I'll build something special here, looked like. The Brooks Dump was where time had stopped. Just like my life. Everything here was discarded, overlooked, left to rust. Seemed fitting that I'd ended up here too. I parked my truck next to what used to be a fence and grabbed my one box of worldly possessions. The silence hit me first. No factory whistles. No Sarah complaining about her dying flowers. No kids asking for money I didn't have. Just whine through rusted metal and the distant sound of my own breathing. For the first time in 3 months, nobody was disappointed in me, because there was nobody around to disappoint. Walking through the maze of junk, I felt like an archaeologist exploring the ruins of someone else's ambitions. Here's a pile of lumber that had rotted into something resembling chocolate cake. There was a tool shed that had apparently lost a fight with a tornado and decided to just lay down and die. My grandfather had always said this place would be worth something someday. Guess he was right. It was worth exactly what I had left. Nothing. I found a relatively flat spot near what used to be a barn and set down my box. Behind a collapsed main structure, there was an old travel trailer from the 70s, faded aluminum siding, flat tires, but the roof was still intact. Home sweet home. Population. One failed carpenter, and whatever critters had claimed squatters' rights over the past few decades. The trailer was like stepping into a time capsule. Avocado green appliances that hadn't worked since Carter was president. A fold-out table that wobbled like a newborn deer. But it was dry, it had 4 walls, and most importantly, it was mine. Day one of my new life involved trying to clear enough space around a trailer to actually live like a human being. Sounds simple enough, right? Wrong. I'm a builder who constructed houses that could survive hurricanes. But apparently I couldn't navigate around a hole that had probably been dug by dinosaurs. And those dinosaurs were definitely better organized than me. I found an old chair outside the trailer, figured I'd earn a break, sat down, and watched it crumble beneath me like my confidence. At least I wasn't the only thing around here that had seen better days. Day 3 brought my first real discovery. The collapsed barn was a maze of fallen beams and scattered junk, but there was one corner where the roof had held, a little pocket of dry space that had been protected from 40 years of Carolina weather. That's where I found it. A guitar case. Old, beat up, covered in dust, but sitting in that one spot where the rain couldn't reach it. It was like my grandfather had known exactly where to put it, like he'd been protecting it, waiting for someone to come looking. I'd never been particularly musical, could barely carry a tune in a bucket with handles, but something about that case pulled at me. Maybe it was the way the afternoon light hit the worn leather. Maybe it was because everything else around here was obviously garbage, and this thing looked like it might have been something special once. Or maybe I was just lonely enough to start having conversations with musical instruments. Picking up the case felt like holding a time capsule. It had weight to it, not just physical weight, but the kind of weight that comes with history, with stories, with secrets that have been keeping themselves for decades. The latches were corroded, but they still worked. Amazing what quality craftsmanship could survive when everything else around it turned to rust. Inside that case was the most beautiful piece of what I'd ever seen. Not that I knew anything about guitars, but I knew wood. I'd been working with lumber my entire adult life, and this wasn't just any wood. This was wood that had been loved, wood that had been played, wood that had stories carved into every grain. A Martin D. 45, according to the label inside. 1937, the year my grandfather was born. But beautiful or not, this guitar was in rough shape. Scratches and dings covered the body like battle scars. The strings were either snapped or missing entirely. The bridge was pulling away from the soundboard like it was trying to escape. She was as damaged as I was, sitting in this wasteland of abandoned projects. We'd found each other in the cemetery of good intentions. Two pieces of neglected craftsmanship nobody else wanted. Just a pile of old wood. Really. Practical Martin kicked in. I needed money, not musical instruments I couldn't play. Time to see what this old thing was worth. The pawn shop on Main Street looked exactly like every pawn shop in America. Bars on the windows, neon signs promising quick cash, and the lingering smell of other people's desperation. Perfect place for a guy with a vintage guitar and a desperate situation. The kid behind the counter couldn't have been more than 25. Probably never worked a day outside air conditioning, judging by how his hands looked like they'd been moisturized daily since birth. He was glued to his phone, swiping through whatever app was keeping his attention span hostage that particular afternoon. I set the case on the counter with the kind of respect you give something that might be valuable. He barely glanced up from his screen. Finally, he looked at the case like I just interrupted his very important social media research. Opened it just enough to peek inside without actually examining anything. Could be a knockoff, he said. Happens all the time. Wood looks decent enough, though. Maybe $50 if I want to be rid of it. People make fake vintage guitars in their garages and try to pass them off as the real deal constantly. Why would anyone want this antique when you could get a brand new electric guitar with built-in effects for the same price? Knock off. This kid was dismissing my grandfather's guitar as garage-made junk without even bothering to really examine it. I felt my face burn with embarrassment, not because of the low offer, but because of how he'd written off something that had survived longer than he'd been alive without giving it the respect of a proper evaluation. Grabbed my case and walked out without saying a word. Some things deserve better treatment than that, even when you're desperate. Back at the Brooks dump, I was more frustrated than I'd been since the day I got laid off. Frustrated at Sarah for giving up on us. Frustrated at the factory for throwing me away. Frustrated at that punk kid for treating my grandfather's guitar like it was worthless. Frustrated at myself for being naive enough to think anything in my life was worth something to anybody else. That evening, anger got the better of me. I picked up that guitar case and threw it harder than I'd thrown anything since high school baseball. The old case hit the ground and split open like it had been waiting 40 years to spill its secrets. Out tumbled the guitar, rolling across the dirt like it was auditioning for a country music video about hard times and heartbreak. But something else fell out too. Something that had been hidden in a secret compartment I hadn't noticed. A leather journal. Old, worn, filled with handwriting I recognized even after all these years. My grandfather's journal. Jonathan Brooks had always been a storyteller. Family gatherings meant listening to his tales about the old days, about people he'd met, places he'd been. Grandma used to roll her eyes and say, "Here he goes again with his wild stories," whenever he'd start talking about his adventures. We kids figure half it was made up. Old men tend to improve their stories with age, you know? But holding his actual journal, reading his actual words, I realized maybe Grandma was wrong. Maybe we should have been listening more carefully. The first few pages were typical grandfather stuff. Weather reports, grocery lists, complaints about politicians that could have been written yesterday. Then I hit the entries from 1953, working as road manager for Hank Williams. That got my attention real quick. My grandfather, the man who fixed farming equipment and told stories nobody quite believed, had apparently spent a year managing the most famous country singer who ever lived. No wonder Grandma thought he was spinning tales. Who would believe that quiet Jonathan Brooks from Asheville had rubbed shoulders with American music royalty? And this guitar, this supposedly worthless knockoff some kid had dismissed without a second thought, this was Hank Williams' personal guitar, the one he'd played on the Louisiana hayride, the one he'd written Your Cheatin' Heart on, the one that had been in my grandfather's care when Hank died in the back of that Cadillac on New Year's Day, 1953. I always thought my grandfather told tall tales, like every grandfather in America. But this wasn't just stories anymore. This was history. American music history. locked away in a leather journal that had been waiting in a secret compartment for someone desperate enough to throw it hard enough to break it open. The serial numbers matched his careful notes. The detailed descriptions matched every scratch and ding. Hell, even the specific, where patterns were cataloged in my grandfather's methodical handwriting. At the bottom of the case, wrapped in an oilcloth that had somehow survived for decades, were photographs, black and white pictures of my grandfather standing next to Hank Williams himself. Young Jonathan Brooks in a suit that actually fit, grinning next to the man who defined country music for generations. Looking at those photos, I could almost feel Hank's fingers moving across those frets. Could almost hear his voice filling the air with songs that made grown men cry and steel workers sing along. This old guitar that had been hiding in plain sight for 40 years wasn't just wood and wire. It was a piece of American music history, a direct connection to the man who'd influenced everyone from Bob Dylan to Bruce Springsteen, a relic from the days when music came from the heart instead of a computer, and it was mine. Sitting there in the dirt, surrounded by 40 years of accumulated junk, holding photographs of my grandfather with one of America's greatest musicians, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Hope. This old guitar, with its scratches and missing strings and stories worth millions, had just become my only chance. But could a man who couldn't carry a tune in a bucket, who didn't know a chord from a doorknob, somehow bring this forgotten melody back to life? The guitar needed more than repair. It needed resurrection. And I was about to find out if a broken-down carpenter could learn to restore something that required rebuilding its very soul. As my grandfather used to say, the best melodies don't play on strings. They play in the heart. Now I just had to figure out if my heart still remembered how to sing. Sitting in that old trailer with my grandfather's journal in my hands, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the factory closed its doors. Purpose. I could almost hear his voice echoing in my head. Like old Jonathan Brooks was standing right there next to me saying what he'd always said when life knocked me down as a kid. You're not the type to quit after the first punch. Are you, Martin? The next morning, I started hunting for my grandfather's old tools. They were scattered across the property like pieces of a puzzle nobody had bothered to solve. Rusty chisels buried under 40 years of leaves. A workbench that had weathered decades but still had good bones. And then there was his tool chest, a masterpiece of organization that had somehow outlasted everything time could throw at it. Opening that chest was like opening a time capsule. Every tool had its place, wrapped in oilcloth that had kept the rust at bay, hand planes that still held their edge, chisels sharp enough to shave with, files and sandpaper organized by grit. My grandfather had been preparing for this moment without even knowing it. Of course, being a carpenter and being a guitar restorer are two completely different animals. My first attempt at removing the old strings resulted in me somehow tangling myself up like a rodeo calf. Took me 20 minutes to get free, and when I finally did, I was holding what looked like a bird's nest made of wire. The guitar just sat there, probably judging my technique. Even broken, it had more dignity than I did. But I'd built houses that were still standing after 20 years. How hard could one guitar be? Famous last words. I started with what I knew, wood. I didn't know guitars, but I knew wood. And this one whispered in a language I'd spent my life learning. Running my hands over that Martin's body, I could feel stories carved into every grain. The deep scratch along the lower bout wasn't damage. It was memory. The worn spot where countless picks had struck wasn't a flaw. It was proof of purpose. It wasn't repair. It was translation. This one had a story, and I was learning the language. Every night, I'd sit in that trailer reading my grandfather's journal by the light of a camping lantern. His handwriting told stories about Hank Williams that no biography had ever captured. The man behind the legend. The perfectionist who would play the same song 30 times until he got it exactly right. My grandfather wrote about watching Hank work, about the way his fingers moved across the frets like he was having a conversation with the instrument itself. I started talking to the guitar while I worked on it. Sounds crazy, but my grandfather had written about how Hank did the same thing. Said the best musicians didn't just play their instruments, they listened to them. So I listened, and slowly, that old Martin started talking back. The neck, had separated from the body, a repair that would have terrified me a month earlier. But working with my grandfather's tools, reading his notes about guitar construction, I felt his hands guiding mine. Every cut, every measurement had to be perfect. As he used to say, if something's worth doing, it's worth doing right. And if you're doing it for yourself, do it like it's the last thing you'll ever do. 3 weeks into the restoration, I found something that made my hand shake. Hidden under the pickup guard, carved so small you'd miss it if you weren't looking, were the initials HW followed by what looked like a tiny musical note. Hank Williams had left his signature in the wood itself. That discovery sent me down a rabbit hole of research. I spent hours at a library reading everything I could find about Hank Williams, about vintage Martin guitars, about the history of country music. The librarian probably thought I was writing a dissertation. I listened to every Hank Williams recording I could get my hands on, trying to hear the sound the specific guitar would have made, trying to understand what made it special. The more I learned, the more I realized how much I didn't know. This wasn't just any guitar. This was potentially one of the most historically significant instruments in American music history. And I was a guy who couldn't even tune the thing. That's when I decided I needed help. Real help from someone who understood guitars the way I understood houses. A little digging led me to Arthur R.D. Blues, a name that kept popping up in vintage guitar forums. Word was he'd been collecting and restoring instruments since before the internet was even a dream. Finding R.D.'s shop was like finding a needle in a haystack, tucked away in a part of town that Google Maps had apparently given up on. It looked more like a storage unit than a business. No sign, no advertising, just a beat-up door with music spilling out from the cracks. I knocked and waited. Knocked again. Finally, the door cracked open. The man who answered looked like he'd stepped out of a 1960s folk album. Wild gray hair, thick glasses held together with electrical tape, and clothes that had seen more decades than most people. He squinted at me like I was trying to sell him insurance or convert him to something. What did I want? Was I from the government? Because he'd already told them he wasn't interested in their surveys. It took 10 minutes of explaining before he'd even let me inside. Apparently, he got a lot of people trying to sell him fake vintage guitars, and he developed a healthy suspicion of strangers carrying guitar cases. But when I mentioned Hank Williams, something in his eyes sharpened. When I said Jonathan Brooks, he opened the door wider. Artie's shop was a museum of American music history. Guitars hung from every wall, some worth more than most people's houses. The smell of wood polish and old leather filled the air like incense. He led me to a workbench covered in tools that made my grandfather's collection look like a toy set. Now, he said, let's see what you've got. I opened the case with the reverence you'd give a religious artifact. Artie bent over the guitar, not touching it at first, just looking. His breathing changed, got deeper, slower, like he was seeing something that mattered. He picked up a magnifying glass and examined the wood grain, the binding, the tuning pegs. Made little humming sounds that could have been approval or concern. Then I showed him the photographs, the journal entries, the careful documentation my grandfather had kept. Artie's hand hovered above the guitar, like he was about to touch a sacred relic. When he finally looked at me, his voice had dropped to almost a whisper. I knew your grandfather, he said quietly. Jonathan Brooks was a treasure of a man. Never bragged, never showed off, but I always suspected he had some kind of incredible secret. Now I see it was something bigger than just wood and wire. The next 2 hours were like getting a masterclass in guitar history. Artie confirmed everything my grandfather had written. The serial numbers matched Martin's records. The construction details were exactly right for a 1937 D-45. Even the wear patterns lined up with how Hank Williams held his instruments. But more than that, Artie helped me understand what I was really holding. It was a witness to greatness, to grief, to genius. The instrument that had given voice to songs that define American culture. The wood that felt the touch of hands that created music, still being played 70 years later. And somehow, impossibly, it found its way to me. Artie offered to help finish the restoration. Said it would be an honor to work on something with this kind of history. But he also warned me about what came next. Once word got out about what I had, everything would change. Collectors would come calling. Museums would want it. Auction houses would start making offers that could set me up for life. After a month of careful work, the restoration was almost complete. The guitar was breathing again, waiting for someone to give it voice. But could a man who'd spent his life in the background bear the weight of the spotlight that wasn't aimed, but inherited? Looking at that Martin D 45, gleaming under Artie's workshop lights, I realized I was about to find out just how much my grandfather's legacy was really worth, and whether I was ready for what that might mean. The moment I strung that Martin D 45 with fresh strings, my hands were shaking like a leaf in a tornado. This was it. Either I'd spent a month bringing a piece of history back to life, or I'd been fooling myself with the most expensive delusion in North Carolina. I positioned my fingers on the frets the way I'd seen in a dozen YouTube videos, took a deep breath, and played my first chord. The sound that came out of that guitar was like nothing I'd ever heard. It wasn't just sound. It was the voice of centuries flowing through my hands. Each note felt like a memory awakening. Each chord rang out like a confession from the wood itself. My fingers seemed to move on their own, like the guitar was teaching me how to play it instead of the other way around. For about 30 seconds, I felt like I understood what my grandfather had written about, the way Hank Williams talked to his instruments, the conversation between musicians, and would that create something bigger than either one alone? Then reality kicked in. I was still a carpenter who couldn't carry a tune, and this was still the most valuable piece of American music history, sitting in a trailer that probably violated 17 health codes. Time to make some calls. I found historic sound auctions online, the kind of high-end auction house that sells guitars for more money than most people make in a lifetime. Their website looked like something from a museum, all marble and mahogany, and people in suits who'd never had dirt under their fingernails. Perfect. The first phone call went about as well as you'd expect. The receptionist listened to my story with the kind of patience reserved for people who clearly belonged in padded rooms. Another guy who'd found an old guitar in his garage and thought he'd struck gold. They probably got 50 calls like mine every week. I could practically hear her rolling her eyes through the phone. But I had something those other callers didn't have. Documentation. Photographs. A paper trail that led straight back to the king of country music himself. I spent the rest of that afternoon scanning every page of my grandfather's journal, every photo, every receipt and ticket stub he'd saved. Uploaded them all to an email that probably crashed their server. 3 days later, my phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, senior authenticator for historic sound auctions. She'd reviewed my materials and would like to arrange an in-person evaluation. Would Thursday work for me? Lady, Thursday worked perfect. So did every other day for the rest of my natural life. Thursday morning. 2 black SUVs pulled up to the Brooks dump like the trailer held a national treasure instead of a busted workbench. Out stepped 3 people who looked like they'd never been within 50 miles of junkyard, all pressed clothes and serious expressions and briefcases that probably cost more than my truck. Dr. Morrison turned out to be a woman in her 50s with silver hair and eyes that had probably authenticated more musical history than the Smithsonian. I led them to the trailer, trying not to notice how they carefully avoided stepping in anything that might stain their expensive shoes. The guitar was waiting on my grandfather's old workbench, case open, ready for inspection. Dr. Morrison approached it like she was entering a church. What followed was the most thorough examination I'd ever witnessed. They measured everything twice, photographed every scratch and ding, compared serial numbers against databases I didn't know existed. Then came the moment of truth. Dr. Morrison nodded to a younger man who'd been carrying what looked like a guitar case of his own. David Chun, she introduced him, professional session musician and guitar specialist. If anyone could make that Martin sing the way it was meant to sing, it was David. He picked up my grandfather's guitar with the reverence most people reserve for newborn babies. First, he tested each string individually, listening to the tension and tone with the kind of focus I'd only seen in my grandfather's eyes when he was examining with grain. Then he began tuning, turning each peg with microscopic adjustments, pausing between each turn to let the strings settle. The whole process took maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like watching a master craftsman prepare for performance of his lifetime. Finally, he positioned his fingers on the frets. Then he played. The sound that filled that old trailer was pure magic. Deep, rich, resonant. The exact tone I'd heard on those scratchy Hank Williams recordings from 70 years ago. It was like Hank Williams himself had returned to play one last song. Dr. Morrison's eyes went wide. David's hands were trembling by the time he finished. The third expert, a wood specialist whose name I never caught, was examining the guitar's body with a magnifying glass and making notes that looked like hieroglyphics. They huddled in a corner for 10 minutes, whispering like they were planning a bank heist. When Dr. Morrison finally spoke, her voice had changed. Gone was the professional skepticism. In its place was something approaching awe. This was authentic, not just a Martin D. 45 from 1937, but specifically the instrument documented in my grandfather's journal, the guitar that had shaped American music history. They wanted to put it up for auction immediately. The next month was a blur of paperwork, media interviews, and attention I'd never asked for and didn't particularly want. Suddenly, every newspaper in the state wanted to talk to the unemployed carpenter who'd found a multi-million-dollar guitar in his grandfather's junk pile. Television crews showed up at the Brooks dump like it was some kind of tourist attraction. The interviews were painful. I'm not built for cameras and questions about my incredible journey and amazing discovery. When one reporter asked about my plan for luxury living, I told him I might upgrade to a pickup truck that didn't require a tetanus shot to drive. That clip ended up on YouTube with 1 million views. Go figure. The auction was scheduled for a Saturday afternoon in Charlotte. Historic Sound Auctions flew me up, put me in a hotel room that was bigger than my trailer, and gave me a suit that probably cost more than I used to make in a month. Standing in that auction house, surrounded by people who wore wealth like aftershave, I felt like an imposter in my own story. The auction room was packed with collectors, museum representatives, and investors who saw dollar signs where I saw my grandfather's legacy. Cameras everywhere. Reporters with notepads. The kind of attention that makes a man want to find the nearest exit. But I stayed. This was my grandfather's moment as much as mine. When they brought out the guitar, a hush fell over the room like someone had just unveiled the crown jewels. The auctioneer started the bidding at $500,000. Within minutes, it had doubled, then tripled. I watched grown men and women wave paddles like they were swatting flies, each gesture representing more money than I'd made in my entire working life. The bidding war came down to two people, a private collector from Nashville and a representative from the Country Music Hall of Fame. Back and forth they went, neither willing to let this piece of history slip away. For million, 4.2, 4.3. My heart was beating so hard I thought it might crack a rib. $4.5 million. Sold to the Country Music Hall of Fame. The room erupted in applause, but all I could hear was silence. This wasn't just money changing hands. This was my grandfather's voice finally being heard after 70 years of silence. I didn't scream or jump or do any of the things you see in movies. I just sat there, feeling a quiet satisfaction wash over me like warm rain. This wasn't just about the money. This was about Jonathan Brooks finally getting the recognition he'd never sought but always deserved. I thought about his smile, about the stories he'd told that we never quite believed, about how right he'd been about everything. The money hit my bank account on Monday morning. More zeros than I'd ever seen in one place. By Monday afternoon, the phone wouldn't stop ringing. Suddenly, I was a long-lost treasure everyone had just rediscovered. Sarah reminisced about our shared journey. Caleb bragged to his friends about his millionaire dad. Emily wept about always believing in me. Funny how money has a better memory than people do. Investment advisors called with strategies for preserving wealth. Reporters wanted follow-up stories. People I hadn't heard from in decades suddenly remembered we'd been best friends. I ignored them all. Every call, every text, every attempt to reconnect with a man who'd suddenly become worth their time. But sitting in that trailer with more money than I'd ever dreamed of, surrounded by the same junk that had been there when I arrived, I had to ask myself the question, that kept me awake at night. Money was one thing, but could it buy back what had been lost? Could it heal the wounds that had been carved into my heart? Could it rebuild the trust that had been shattered? I had millions now, but did I have a real home? A real family? Or was I still just a man living alone in a trailer, surrounded by the echoes of other people's abandoned dreams? The guitar was gone. The applause had faded. But somewhere in the silence of that trailer, my grandfather's ghost was still waiting. Not for money, not for recognition, just to see what I'd do next. And honestly, I wasn't sure I knew the answer to that question yet. 2 weeks after the auction, they came. I was sitting on the porch of my trailer, looking out at the Brooks dump that wasn't much of a dump anymore. Having money changes your perspective on things like lawn mowers and professional landscaping services. The place actually looked respectable now. That's when I saw the familiar minivan pulling up the gravel drive. Sarah got out first, followed by Caleb and Emily. They walked toward me like they were approaching a wild animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. The Brooks dump had been transformed, but so had I. Money doesn't just change your bank account. It changes how people see you, how they treat you, how they remember loving you. Caleb was the first to speak. Without saying a word, he pulled out an old photograph from his wallet, the one I'd given him years ago of me and his great-grandfather Jonathan working on a birdhouse together. He handed it to me with shaking hands and said he was sorry, really sorry, for not believing in me when things got tough, for being embarrassed by his unemployed dad, for caring more about college tuition than his father's dignity. Emily wrapped her arms around me like she used to when she was little and had nightmares, held on tight like she was afraid I might disappear again. Sarah stood back, watching this reunion with calculating eyes, always working the angles, always looking for the best way to position herself. She cleared her throat and launched into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about second chances and family healing. Then came the real pitch. Maybe I could invest in her flower business now? She'd already ordered the most expensive imported fertilizers money could buy. This time would definitely be different. I looked at her for a long moment, then said something that surprised even me. Sarah, I'm already investing in a future that doesn't wilt. The kids laughed at that. First time I'd heard Emily laugh in months. I forgave them all, right there on the spot. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it sure doesn't mean going backward. Forgiveness means letting go, and I needed that release more than they needed my absolution. Some bridges are better burned. I told them, not out of spite, but to keep yourself from being tempted to return to places that were never really home. Caleb nodded like he understood. Emily looked hurt, but accepting. Sarah looked like she was calculating the cost of those imported fertilizers. They left an hour later, and I felt lighter than I had in years. The next morning, I made a phone call that would have seemed impossible 6 months earlier. I called the bank that held the mortgage on Global Woodworks Incorporated, the factory where I'd lost my job, my dignity, and my faith in the American dream. Turns out everything has a price, including your past. It took 3 weeks of paperwork, but I bought the whole operation. Not for revenge. That would have been too small, too bitter. This was about transformation, about taking a place where dreams want to die and turning it into somewhere they could be reborn. I had plans, big plans. The Jonathan Brooks Academy. That's what I was going to call it. A place where people could learn real skills with their hands, where veterans could find purpose after service, where folks who'd lost jobs to automation could discover they still had value, where young people could learn that building something that lasts is worth more than any algorithm. The old factory floor would become workshops. The executive offices would become classrooms. The parking lot where I'd cleaned out my locker in shame would become a place where people arrived each morning with hope. This wasn't just a factory anymore. This was going to be a place where dreams got built instead of broken down. It took 8 months to renovate the whole place. I worked alongside the contractors, partly because I missed the feel of tools in my hands, and partly because I wanted to make sure every detail was right. The grand opening was set for a Saturday in October. Perfect North Carolina weather, leaves turning colors that reminded you why people wrote songs about autumn. The night before the ceremony, I was doing one final walkthrough when I decided to completely dismantle that old guitar case. I wanted to make sure there weren't any more secrets hiding in corners I'd missed. That's when I found it. Another hidden compartment, smaller than the first, tucked behind the neck support. Inside was a yellowed envelope with my name written in my grandfather's careful handwriting. Not Martin or to my grandson, just for the one who doesn't give up. He'd known. Somehow, he'd known that someday I'd need to find this exact message at this exact moment. The letter was short, but it hit like a sledgehammer to the chest. If you're reading this he'd written, it means you didn't quit. And I always believed you could do anything you set your mind to. Remember, real value isn't in what you own, but in who you are and what you build. Let that guitar be more than music. Let it be your voice. And remember, Martin, legacy isn't what you leave behind. Legacy is what you leave in other people's hearts. I sat there in that empty factory, holding my grandfather's final words, and cried like I hadn't cried since I was 10 years old. The grand opening was everything I'd hoped it would be. Local politicians showed up for the photo opportunities. Former co-workers came to see what their old workplace had become. Reporters documented the transformation from Rust Belt relic to modern training facility. But the moment that mattered most was when I cut the ribbon. Standing there with those oversized scissors, looking out at faces full of hope and possibility, I finally understood what my grandfather had been trying to teach me all along. Success isn't about the size of your bank account or the recognition you receive. It's about the difference you make, the lives you touch, the dreams you help others discover. The first class of students started the following Monday. 20 people, ranging from an 18-year-old kid who'd never held a tool to a 60-year-old veteran who'd lost his way after leaving the service. I made them all start the same way I'd started, sorting through piles of junk, learning to see value in things other people had thrown away. You have to know what real trash looks like, I told them, before you can recognize genuine treasure. They'd grown at the philosophy lesson, but they did the work. And slowly, over weeks and months, I watched them discover what I'd learned in that trailer. That real craftsmanship isn't about perfect lines or flawless finishes. It's about perfect respect for your materials, your tools, and yourself. That every mistake is a lesson, and every lesson makes you stronger. That building something with your hands connects you to something larger than yourself. 6 months after opening, we had a waiting list. A year later, we were placing graduates in jobs across 3 states. 2 years later, we opened a second location. But the numbers weren't what mattered. What mattered were the letters I got from students who'd found their purpose, their confidence, their voice. I kept my grandfather's final letter in my office, framed next to a picture of that old Martin D 45. Visitors always asked about both, and I'd tell them the whole story. The factory closing, the divorce, the junk pile, the discovery. But mostly, I'd tell them about Jonathan Brooks, who'd saved more than just a guitar. He'd saved his grandson's faith in what was possible. My life became a symphony of triumph, where every note, even the most bitter ones, eventually led to harmony. I never got rich in the way people measure wealth, but I got something better. I got to watch broken people discover they weren't broken at all, just misplaced. And every evening, when the academy was quiet and the students had gone home to their families, I'd walk through those workshops and remember what my grandfather had written. Legacy isn't what you leave behind. It's what you leave in other people's hearts. The guitar was gone, sold to its rightful place in history, but its voice lived on in every hand that learned to build, every dream that found direction, every person who discovered their worth. That old Martin D, 45, had taught me the most important lesson of all. The best music isn't played on strings. It's played in the lives we touch, the hope we share, and the legacy we choose to leave. And that's a song that never ends.